All right, so today we are going to try to take a deep dive into the life of Adolf Hitler.
Okay.
As you know, he left quite a devastating mark on history.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore his journey from, early on to just the impact he had on the world.
Right.
And the goal is to understand how this happened.
Of course.
Not to glorify it.
Right.
But what's so fascinating is that our sources show that he actually started out wanting to be an artist.
Really?
And he even got Iron Cross medals for bravery in World War I.
Wow.
It's who would have guessed?
Yeah, that contrast between, his early aspirations and his actions is pretty striking.
Right.
It really makes you wonder, how people can go down such dark paths.
Exactly.
I mean, his early life does offer some clues, though.
Okay.
He was born in Austria, but back in 1889.
Right.
And even as a kid, he was drawn to art.
Oh, wow.
He dreamed of going to the Vienna Academy.
Really?
But he kept getting rejected.
So this wasn't just some starving artist thing.
No, not really.
What was the big deal about these rejections?
Well, Vienna at the time, the turn of the 20th century, it was this huge mix of, cultures and ideas.
Right.
But there was also a lot of, rising nationalism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
So you can kind of imagine Hitler, right, already kind of dealing with rejection from his, strict father, now facing it from this art world that he thought was everything.
Right.
It's not hard to see how that could have made him resentful.
Yeah.
He was being denied his place in society.
I see.
And that mixed with all the, prejudices of the time.
Yeah.
It's easy to see how that could be, manipulated and pointed at scapegoats.
Yeah, it's his own personal rejection became fuel for something much bigger.
Yeah.
And more dangerous.
Exactly.
And then, as if things weren't already a mess.
Right.
World War I happens.
Yeah, World War I really changed everything.
Okay.
So even though he was Austrian,
Right.
Hitler actually volunteered for the German army. In 1914,
Wow.
he served on the front lines.
Wow.
Even earned those Iron Crosses for his bravery.
So he was right in the thick of it.
Oh, yeah. This wasn't some abstract conflict for him.
Right.
He saw the brutality firsthand, the camaraderie, the horrors, the intense nationalism.
Okay, so we're seeing these personal experiences kind of lining up with, bigger historical events.
Right.
But how did World War I specifically contribute to his later ideology?
Well, you got to remember that Germany losing World War I, it was really traumatic for a lot of people. I mean, they were dealing with economic hardship, political instability, humiliation.
Yeah.
Hitler had fully embraced, German nationalism during the war. So he took this loss really hard. His wartime experiences and, that bitterness, it made him believe that Germany had been betrayed.
Oh.
Stabbed in the back by its own people.
So he's got this, pre-existing resentment from before.
Right.
Plus all that intense nationalism from the war. And then the trauma of defeat.
Exactly.
The perfect recipe for something really bad to happen.
Yeah, a really dangerous mix.
And I'm guessing this is where the German Workers' Party comes in.
Right, which later becomes the Nazi Party.
Right, of course.
After the war, Germany was like a breeding ground for extremist ideas.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
People were desperate for solutions, someone to blame, a way to get back to greatness.
Yeah.
And the German Workers' Party, with all its, nationalism and populist rhetoric, it gave them an outlet for all that frustration.
Makes sense.
And in that kind of environment, a charismatic speaker like Hitler, who could tap into those anxieties and, offer easy answers, he was bound to rise.
And rise he did.
He did.
It wasn't long before he took over the party completely.
Right.
Turned it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
The infamous Nazi Party.
Nazi Party.
Yeah.
And his message was pretty clear.
Oh, yeah.
Restore Germany to glory. And to do that, they had to get rid of all the enemies within.
The scapegoats.
Right.
He blamed the Jews, the communists, liberals, anyone he could paint as a threat to Germany.
Wow.
And for a population that was hurting and looking for answers, that message really resonated.
It's disturbing how he turned all that suffering into such a hateful ideology.
Yeah.
It's almost like he used setbacks to fuel his ambition.
That's a good point.
Remember how we talked about him being rejected as an artist?
I do.
Well, his early political career was kind of similar.
How so?
In 1923, he tried to grab power.
Oh, right.
in what they called the beer hall push.
Yeah.
But it failed miserably.
It did.
Yeah.
You know the beer hall putsch,
Right.
which was essentially a failed coup in Munich?
Right.
It shows how Hitler used even his failures to his advantage.
Oh, interesting.
He got imprisoned for his role in it.
Of course.
But he used that time to really develop his ideology.
Okay.
And that's when he wrote Mein Kampf.
Ah, Mein Kampf, his autobiography.
Yeah. His autobiography and like his twisted political testament.
So what was the big deal about this book?
Well, Mein Kampf, it was more than just, him ranting.
Yeah.
It was him laying out his whole worldview.
Oh, wow.
His theories about race, his hatred of Jews and other groups,
Okay.
his vision for a racially pure Germany,
Right.
and his plans for expanding German territory.
So it was like the blueprint for the Nazi Party.
Exactly, it was.
So we have a failed artist turned political agitator
Right.
who uses prison to write a book that becomes a bestseller.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. And all this is happening in a Germany that's, wounded and vulnerable,
Right.
ready to be manipulated.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is.
And that disaster unfolds in the 1930s.
Yeah, the 1930s were a time of just immense global turmoil.
Right.
The Great Depression had crippled economies everywhere.
Of course.
And Germany was hit especially hard.
Yeah.
Social and political climates were volatile, with these extremist ideologies gaining traction.
So Hitler, with his promises of, revival and scapegoats to blame,
Yeah,
he was in the perfect position.
he was.
It's like he was just waiting for his chance.
It seems that way.
And he took it.
He did.
In 1933, through, political maneuvering and some intimidation,
Right.
he became Chancellor of Germany.
That's right.
And from there, he just dismantled democracy.
He consolidated his power quickly.
It's scary how fast things changed.
It is.
One minute he's in prison, the
Yeah.
next he's leading a country towards tyranny and destruction.
And what's really unsettling is how he used democracy itself
Yeah.
to destroy it.
Right.
He used the existing system.
Okay.
He exploited people's anxieties
Yeah.
and systematically silenced anyone who opposed him.
That's a reminder of just how fragile democracy can be.
It is, especially during a crisis.
This change from chancellor to dictator, that was a huge turning point.
It was.
What were the signs of his dictatorship?
Well, he quickly established a totalitarian regime
Okay.
where the Nazi Party controlled everything.
Wow.
Propaganda and fear were his main tools.
Right.
He demonized his opponents, suppressed dissent,
Yeah.
and created a culture of paranoia and conformity.
I see.
The media was totally controlled.
Right.
Anyone who spoke out was silenced.
So it wasn't just about political power.
No.
It was about controlling how people thought.
Right. Their whole perception of reality.
Yeah.
He made it so that questioning the regime or expressing different views or just being part of the wrong group
Yeah.
have terrible consequences.
And this is where the persecution of Jews and other minorities really starts.
Yeah, that's right. The beginning of the Holocaust.
Holocaust.
But we'll get into that more in part 2.
Right, of course.
Anything else you want to touch on about his rise to power?
Yeah, before we move on,
Okay.
I think it's important to remember that his rise wasn't inevitable.
That's a good point.
It was a lot of things coming together.
Like what?
His personality, his ambition, the historical context,
Right.
the problems within German society,
Yeah.
and the fact that people underestimated him.
Yeah, they really did.
It's like history isn't just a straight line.
No, it's not.
It's shaped by choices and circumstances.
And sometimes tragic mistakes.
Yeah, and it's tempting to see people like Hitler as, monsters.
Yeah.
Like they're separate from normal human events.
Right.
But his story is a warning
A warning about what?
about being complacent,
Okay.
about how fragile democracy is,
Right.
and how easy it is to fall for simple solutions to complicated problems.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Thanks.
All right, so we've covered a lot in part 1.
We have.
We talked about his early dreams of being an artist, his time in the war,
Yeah.
his rise in the Nazi Party,
Right.
and his transformation into a dictator.
It's a lot to process,
It is.
but it's important to understand how this happened.
Exactly.
So we can be more vigilant, more aware, and more determined to prevent something like this from happening again.
Yeah.
Because we do have the power to learn from the past
Right.
and build a more tolerant and just future.
Well said. All right, be sure to join us for part 2,
Yes.
where we'll delve into World War II
Right.
and the horrors of the Holocaust.
It's a difficult chapter to explore,
It is.
but it's necessary
To understand this tragedy.
and learn from the mistakes that were made.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
See you in part 2.
See you then. Welcome back. So, as we go deeper into, the things that really shaped Hitler's reign, we have to talk about like the darkest chapter, World War II and the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. And I mean, we already talked about how he came to power and how his ideology got stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
But how did all that internal repression in Germany, explode outwards into a global conflict?
Well, Hitler's ambitions weren't just about Germany.
Oh.
He believed in this idea of
Lebensraum.
Yeah, it basically means living space.
Okay.
And he wanted to expand eastward to create this huge German empire.
Wow.
It was all rooted in this belief that Germans were racially superior and that they needed more land for resources.
So he was basically setting the stage for war from the beginning.
Yeah, in a lot of ways he was.
Okay.
When he invaded Poland in September 1939, that was the official start of World War II.
Right.
It was a calculated act of aggression.
Yeah.
And the world reacted. Great Britain and France declared war on Germany.
Right.
And things escalated really quickly.
Okay.
It drew in countries from all over the globe.
Yeah, this is where we see just how global this conflict was.
Exactly.
It wasn't just in Europe. It involved countries from every continent.
Right. It was the Axis powers.
Okay.
Led by Germany, Italy, and Japan.
Right.
Against the Allies, mainly, the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union.
Wow.
It was a clash of ideologies, military might, and in the end, a fight for the future of the world.
It's easy to get lost in the sheer scale of it all.
I know.
The battles, the alliances, the strategies.
Well,
but we can't forget that woven into all of this was something truly horrific.
Right.
The systematic extermination of millions in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Earlier, you said over 6 million Jewish people were murdered. That's just an unimaginable number.
It is, and it's important to remember that this wasn't just some accident of war.
Right.
The Holocaust was planned.
Oh, wow.
It was deliberate, a meticulously planned act of genocide.
Genocide.
Woven by Hitler's fanatical ideology of racial purity.
Racial purity.
The Nazis, they targeted Jews, but also other groups they considered undesirable.
Like who?
Roma people, disabled people, political opponents, LGBTQ individuals. They rounded them up, deported them, imprisoned them in ghettos and concentration camps.
Yeah.
And in the end, they murdered them.
It's hard to even fathom the logistics of something so horrific.
I know.
How did they carry out this genocide on such a massive scale?
The Nazis were terrifyingly efficient.
Okay.
They created this huge network of concentration camps all across Europe.
Really?
Each one with its own grim purpose.
Like what?
Extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Right.
Those were equipped with gas chambers and crematoria. For mass murder.
So horrific.
And then there were forced labor camps.
Okay.
Where prisoners were worked to death in horrible conditions.
It's just unimaginable.
And then transit camps.
What were those?
Those were like holding areas where they sorted victims and sent them to their final destination.
So it was a whole system.
Yeah.
Designed for mass murder.
A horrifyingly efficient machine of death.
And this was happening at the same time as the war?
Yeah.
How was the world reacting to all of this?
It's complicated. I mean, there were people and groups who risked their lives to help those being persecuted.
That's good.
But information about what was really happening in the Holocaust, it was often suppressed or people didn't believe it.
Really?
The world was focused on the immediate threat of the Axis powers.
Right.
So the full horror of what was happening in the camps, it wasn't widely known or understood until much later.
That's a scary thought. That such evil could happen while the world was fighting against tyranny.
It is.
Were there any turning points in the war?
Well,
moments where Hitler's power started to weaken.
Actually, Hitler's own mistakes played a big part in his downfall.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941.
Okay.
Operation Barbarossa.
Barbarossa.
It was a huge miscalculation.
How so?
He underestimated the Red Army.
Okay.
And just how vast Russia is.
I remember reading that winter played a big role in that campaign.
Oh, yeah. The German forces weren't prepared for a long winter war.
Right.
They faced brutal conditions and fierce resistance.
Wow.
The invasion stalled, and the German army suffered heavy losses.
So that was a turning point.
It was the beginning of the end for Hitler.
And then there's his decision to declare war on the United States.
Right after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Another huge mistake.
Why?
Because he brought the full might of the U.S. military into the war against him.
Wow.
He basically sealed his own fate.
Yeah, I can see that.
The combined forces of the Allies with American resources and Soviet determination, they slowly pushed back the Nazi war machine.
So while he was orchestrating the Holocaust, he was also making decisions that would lead to his own destruction.
Exactly. It's a strange paradox.
It is.
His belief in his own destiny, his twisted view of reality, they ultimately contributed to his downfall.
Wow.
He refused to acknowledge the defeats.
Okay.
Surrounded himself with people who just agreed with him.
Right.
And retreated further into delusion.
Which is where we find him at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Isolated, defeated, the world closing in.
Exactly. By 1945, the tide had turned.
Okay.
Allied forces were closing in on Berlin from both sides.
Right.
Hitler was trapped in his bunker underneath the Chancellery.
Wow.
Just a shadow of his former self.
It's crazy how quickly things can change.
I know, right? His dreams of a 1,000-year Reich?
Yeah.
They were in ruins.
It was all over.
His armies were decimated, his ideology exposed as a monstrous lie.
It seems like a fitting end for a man who caused so much suffering.
You would think.
So this is where we see his final act.
Right.
His desperate attempt to avoid responsibility.
It was a grim ending to a horrific chapter. So we've been exploring like the rise and fall of Hitler.
Yeah, from frustrated artist to dictator.
Right.
And then to architect of, global conflict and genocide.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
It has, but what about the aftermath?
Right.
Like what happened when the fighting stopped?
Well, I mean, it's hard to overstate just how devastating it was.
Okay.
Europe was in ruins. Cities were bombed out, economies shattered, and the human cost was almost unimaginable.
I can't imagine.
Millions dead families torn apart, entire communities just wiped out.
It's awful.
And then there was the psychological scar, the trauma of a world that had witnessed such cruelty.
You mentioned earlier that people didn't really know about the full extent of the Holocaust until later in the war.
Right.
So what happened when it all came out?
Well, it was a huge wake-up call for the world.
Okay.
The images from the concentration camps, the stories of survivors, the sheer scale of the genocide, it's shocked and horrified people.
Right.
And it made them determined to make sure it would never happen again.
So amidst all the grief and destruction, did any good come out of this?
Well, out of that catastrophe, there was this push for international cooperation and a renewed focus on human rights.
Right.
The United Nations was formed in 1945.
The UN?
Yeah, as a direct response to the horrors of the war.
So they wanted to prevent future conflicts.
Exactly, to promote diplomacy and to set international standards for human rights.
It's like humanity had looked into the abyss.
Yeah.
And realized it needed to change.
It was about rebuilding trust and a sense of shared humanity.
What about Germany?
Right.
How did they deal with their Nazi past?
Well, the process of denazification.
Denazification.
It was complicated.
Okay.
Germany was occupied by the Allied powers.
Right.
And there was a big effort to dismantle Nazi institutions, remove Nazi symbols, and bring war criminals to justice.
I see.
But it was also about Germany coming to terms with its past.
Right.
Educating new generations about what happened.
Okay.
And confronting the role that ordinary citizens played.
So it wasn't just about punishment.
No.
It was about rebuilding a society based on different values.
Exactly.
A society that understood and rejected the Nazi ideology.
It was a long and painful process, and it's still going on today.
Really?
Germany has made progress in confronting its history.
Yeah.
But the legacy of Nazism is still a very complex and sensitive issue.
It makes you wonder, looking back at everything that happened, what are the big takeaways?
What can we learn from this dark chapter?
Yeah, what can we learn?
Well, one crucial lesson is that we can't be complacent.
Okay.
Hitler was able to take advantage of a democratic society, using propaganda and fear to control people and grab power.
So it's a reminder that democracy is fragile.
It is. We have to be vigilant to participate and defend it.
Against those who would try to destroy it.
Exactly.
So it's not just about remembering what happened.
Yeah.
It's about learning from it and applying those lessons today.
Right.
We need to be aware of the warning signs.
And recognize that tyranny can happen anywhere.
Even in societies that seem stable.
Absolutely. Another important lesson is that individual actions matter.
Okay.
We talked about the people who resisted the Nazis, who risked their lives to help others.
They were incredibly brave.
They remind us that even when faced with evil, we have the power to make a difference.
Right.
To choose compassion and courage.
It's a powerful message.
It is. We're not just passive observers of history.
We have agency.
And our choices matter.
Even in small ways.
Yeah. And finally, I think Hitler's story shows the dangers of unchecked ambition.
Okay.
Of fanaticism and of believing in easy answers to complex problems. We need critical thinking empathy and a willingness to understand different viewpoints.
To protect ourselves from extremism and intolerance.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hitler's life, it's clear that his legacy is complicated and disturbing.
It is.
It's a legacy of unimaginable suffering, but also one of resilience, resistance, and hope.
We may never fully understand how such darkness took over the world.
Though we can learn from it.
Yeah, by honoring the memory of those who were lost, by confronting injustice, and by working to create a better future.
A future where these horrors are never repeated.
Exactly.
It's a reminder of the responsibility we all share.
That's a good way to put it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
We hope it's been informative and thought-provoking.
And hopefully a call to action.
Let's all learn from history and work together to build a more just and compassionate world.
I agree with that.